Topsy-Turvy by Jules Verne, translated by Anonymous. Chapter 20, in which this story, as truthful as it is improbable, is finished. Barbicane. Nickel. Maston. You. We. And in this plural pronoun, uttered simultaneously by the two associates in a single voice, might be heard a flood of irony and reproaches. J.T. Maston pressed his iron hook on his forehead. Then, with a voice which seemed to stick in his throat, he said, "Did your shaft at Kilimanjaro really have a diameter of 27 meters?" "Yes, sir." "Did your projectile really weigh 180 millions of kilograms?" "Yes." "And was the shooting really done with 2,000 pounds of melimelonite?" "Yes." This thrice repeated yes fell on J.T. Maston like masses of stone on his head. "Then I can only conclude," he said. "What?" asked President Barbicane. "As follows," said J.T. Maston. "As the operation did not succeed, the powder did not give to the projectile an initial velocity of 2,800 kilometers." "Really?" said Captain Nicholl with a tone of sarcasm. "Yes, your melimelonite is only good to charge pistols of straw." Captain Nicholl sprang up at this remark, which was an outrageous insult to him. "Maston," he said, "Nicholl, you ought to be blown up with the melimelonite. No, gun cotton, that is more sure." Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt had to interfere and cool these two enraged gunners down. "Gentlemen," she said, between associates. "And anyhow," President Barbicane resumed with a very calm expression, "what is the good of criminations? It is certain that the calculations of our friend J.T. Maston were correct, as it is certain that the explosive of our friend Nicholl had sufficient power. Yes, we have only employed known quantities of science. We lacked experience. Why did we fail? Perhaps we may never know." "Well," said the secretary of the Gun Club, "we will commence all over again." "And the money which has been spent for this operation is a dead loss," observed Captain Nicholl. "But public opinion," said Evangelina Scorbitt, "will not allow you a second trial." "What will become of our Arctic region?" said Captain Nicholl. "Where will the stock of the N.P.P.A. fall to?" said President Barbicane. "Well, it has already fallen so far that the stock was offered at the price of old paper." This, then, was the result of the gigantic operation. This was the memorable fiasco to which the superhuman projects of Barbicane and Company had led. If ever engineers, unlucky engineers, were laughed at in public, if ever the newspaper made drawings, songs, and paragraphs not at all flattering to the people mentioned in them, this occasion exceeded them all. President Barbicane, the directors of the new society, and their associates of the Gun Club were universally sneered at. In every language they were made ridiculous, and to make it easier to the whole population of the world to read, the scornful articles were printed in Volapük. In Europe, especially, all the remarks and songs to make the persons of the N.P.P.A. ridiculous were spread broadcast. The great hit was made by a Frenchman, who composed the ballad which was sung in every concert hall in France and America. But will we never know to what the failure of this enterprise was due? Did this failure prove that the operation was impossible of realization? That the powers at the disposal of mankind would never be sufficient to bring about a change in the earth's movement? Did it prove that the country around the North Pole would never be removed to those regions where the sun and heat would melt the ice without human help? Information on this subject came a few days after the return of President Barbicane and Captain Nicholl to the United States. A very simple paragraph appeared in the Times of the 17th of October. Here is the article. We all know that the result of the operation to create a new axis has been nothing. However, the calculations of J.T. Maston, founded on established facts, would have produced the desired result if, through an unexplainable slip, an error had not been embraced in them from the beginning. When the celebrated secretary of the Gun Club took for a basis of his calculations the circumference of the earth's sphere, he figured it at 40,000 meters in place of 40,000,000 meters, and to which the failing of the operation is due. Where could such an error come from? Who could have provoked it? How could such a remarkable calculator commit such an error? It is certain that had the problem of the modification of the earth's axis been correctly figured, it would have been exactly solved. But this forgetting of 3 zeros has made a change at the end of the calculation of 12 knots. It is not a cannon 1,000,000 times larger than that of 27 centimeters which was necessary. A trillion of these cannons, throwing a trillion projectiles of 80,000 tons each, would be necessary to displace the North Pole. Admitting that the melimelonite had the expansive power which had been attributed to it by Captain Nicholl. Therefore, the whole shock under the conditions under which it was produced has displaced the North Pole only 0.003 of a millimeter, and has only changed the level of the ocean at the most 0.009 of 0.003 of a millimeter. In regard to the projectile fired, it will be a small planet, and will belong in future to the solar system, sustained by solar attraction. Alcide Pierdeux. So this want of attention on the part of J.T. Maston at the beginning of his calculations had produced such a humiliating result for his company. But even if his associates were very angry against him, if everybody laughed and joked at him, it is only fair to state in his favor that this mistake which had wrecked the operation had spared the world a terrible catastrophe. A flood of telegrams and letters arrived from all parts of the world, congratulating J.T. Maston on his mistake of 3 knots. J.T. Maston, more downhearted and crushed than ever, would not listen to the hurrahs which the world now uttered for him. President Barbicane, Captain Nicholl, Tom Hunter with the wooden legs, Colonel Bloomsbury, the gay Bilsby, and his associates would never pardon him. But Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt, she could not be angry with him, most excellent lady. J.T. Maston had begun to do his calculations over again, refusing to admit that he was wrong on that point. He was, however. The engineer, Alcide Pierdeux, had not made a mistake. Having learnt his error at the last moment, when he had no time to make it known, he had remained perfectly composed among all the fright and terror of those about him. That was why he proposed a toast of champagne at the moment when the shooting was taking place in the Old World. Yes, indeed, 3 knots had been forgotten in the circumference of the earth. Suddenly J.T. Maston remembered the whole matter. It was the beginning of his work when he had shut himself up in the ballistic cottage, and written the number 40,000,000 on his blackboard. At that moment the electric bell began to ring with great force. J.T. Maston went to the phone. He exchanged a few words with Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt. Suddenly a terrible stroke of lightning from the storm through the telephone knocked over his blackboard and himself. He got up, commenced to write over again the numbers which had been half rubbed out on his blackboard. He had just written the numbers 40,000 when the telephone rang for the second time. He went again to listen to Madame Scorbitt, and when he did begin his work he forgot to put on the last 3 knots of the earth's circumference. It was the fault of Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt. If she had not interrupted him, he would not have been thrown on the floor by the shock from the telephone. He would not have noticed anything of lightning and thunder, and all his mass of figures and calculations would not have ended in a mistake. What a terrible blow it was to this unhappy lady when J.T. Maston was compelled to tell her the circumstances which had produced the mistake. Yes, she was the cause of the disaster. It was on her account that J.T. Maston found himself dishonored through the long years which he had yet to live, as nearly every member of the Gun Club usually lived to the age of 100 years. After this conversation at New Park, J.T. Maston had gone away from the mansion. He went back to his ballistic cottage, and walked into his study muttering to himself, "Well, now I am not good for anything any more in this world." "Not even good enough to get married?" said a broken voice at his elbow. It was that of Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt. Absolutely crushed and heartbroken, she had followed him. "Dear Maston," she began. "Well, yes," he said, "but only under one condition, that I shall never make any mathematical calculations." "My dear friend, I have a horror of them," answered the excellent widow. Thus it happened that the secretary of the Gun Club made Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt Mrs. J.T. Maston. In regard to the article of Alcide Pierdeux, we might say that it brought him into great celebrity and reputation. It was translated into all languages, printed in every paper, and thus his name became known all over the world. The father of his old sweetheart had refused him his daughter's hand, after telling him that he could not give him his daughter as he was too smart. But now, after having read his article and being unable to understand it without any help, he began to feel sorry, and no better. He sent him an invitation to dine with him and his daughter. Chapter 21. Very short, since enough has been said to make the world's population feel perfectly sure again. And now the inhabitants of the world could again be perfectly easy. President Barbicane and Captain Nicholl will not again begin that enterprise so woefully miscarried. J.T. Maston will not again figure out any calculations, however free from mistakes. The article of Alcide Pierdeux has told the truth. What the law of mechanics proves to us is that to produce a displacement of the axis of 23 degrees and 28 minutes, even with the melimelonite, a trillion cannon similar to the one which had been bored into the cliff of Kilimanjaro would be necessary. But our whole sphere, bored over its whole surface, is too small to accommodate them. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth may sleep in peace. To modify the conditions in which the earth is moving is beyond the efforts of humanity. It is not meet that mere humanity should change anything in the order established by our Creator in the system of the universe. End of the Voyage Extraordinaire. End of chapters 20 and 21. Recording by David Lawrence, May 2010 in Brampton, Ontario. End of Topsy-Turvy by Jules Verne. Translated by Anonymous.